Ta-da!
Close combat. Models whose bases are touching are engaged in hand-to-hand combat. This can only happen once a warrior has charged his enemy, as models are otherwise not allowed to move into contact. In the close combat phase now, all models will be allowed the chance to fight. A warrior can fight against enemies to his side, front, or rear. In reality, the fighters are constantly moving, dodging, and weaving as they struggle to kill their adversaries. So what this means is that when you're playing Mordheim, there's a difference from fantasy, and that you are not going to be suffering from fighting to the rear or to the side. It is important to remember that if you are in combat, such as these two, and you are an archer with ranged weapons, you are not allowed to shoot while you are in combat. Who can strike first? In Mordheim, the model that is allowed to strike first is the one that was able to pull off a successful charge. So if this guy, for example, charged that orc, then that archer would begin regardless of their initiatives. Otherwise, if we don't have any charges, we go after initiative order. Say this archer has an initiative of 3 and the orc has an initiative of 2, then the archer will begin and the orc will then strike after him. With tied initiatives, roll off a d6 to see who will begin. Let's say that these two over here have the same initiative of 3. We'll say this is the black dice, this is the white dice. Let's roll it off to see the white dice will get the start. And remember, of course, that if a model stood up in the recovery phase and is still in combat, that model will always strike last in the combat, regardless of its initiative. Which models fight? A model can fight if its base is touching the base of an enemy model. Even models attacked from the side or rear can fight. If a warrior is touching more than one enemy, he can choose which to attack. If he has more than one attack, he can divide them in any way the player wishes, so long as he makes this clear before rolling to hit. In this case now we see that this archer is in base contact with both of these orcs. Now had this archer had 2 attacks, he could divide them, putting 1 on each if he would like, or 2 on a single one. Once we are now in base contact and we are prepared to hit the enemy, we may now roll 1d6 for each attack that the model has. In the case of the Empire Archer, we have 1 attack, so we will roll 1 die. To determine now whether the archer hits, we will have to compare the weapon skill of the archer, which in this case is a 3, versus the weapon skill of the orc, which is also a 3. Having determined the weapon skill of each, we may now look at the to-hit chart. The first thing to do is to find the attacker's weapon skill on the left, in this case a 3, and find the opponent's weapon skill on the top, also a 3, and come to the point where they converge. And what we see now is that we need 4s to hit. Rolling now to hit. And that is a 2, that will be a miss. With the archer having missed now, the orc now has an opportunity to attack back. So we compare his weapon skill to that of the archer. Once again, 3 to a 3. So he will also need 4s to hit. And he also misses. A couple of brief notes about weapons. Some warriors may be able to carry 2 weapons, 1 in each hand. In this case, a warrior armed with 2 one-handed weapons may make 1 extra attack with the additional weapon. So this orc might be modeled to show this, that he has 2 weapons, and that will be clear when you are buying the gear for your warband. In other cases, a warrior might be armed with 2 different weapons, for example, a sword and a dagger, and he will then have to make a single attack with whichever weapon he chooses, and all others with the remaining weapon. So roll to hit and wound for each weapon separately. Weapon modifiers. Unlike hits from shooting, the strength of the attacker is used to determine wounds rather than that of the weapon itself. However, some weapons confer a bonus on the attacker's strength. Make sure you just read about the weapons when you arm your warbands to see which weapons do what and the strength of each weapon. Let's continue on now with this combat where we left off. Let's say for the sake of this example that we indeed rolled a 4 when we were attacking with the archer, which is enough to hit. At this point we will now have to roll to wound. In order to determine if we have wounded now, we will need to compare the strength of the attacker with any weapon modifiers versus that of the toughness of the target. Let's say for this example now that the archer is just using normal weapons, and he has a strength of 3 when he attacks, and our orc has a toughness of 4. Once we have determined these values, we may then look to the wound chart. Let's begin by finding the attacker's strength on the left side, a 3 in this case, and go to the top and find the target's toughness, in this case a 4, and move to the point where they converge, and we see that we will need to roll 5s in order to wound. Rolling now for 1 hit, and that's a 4, so there is no wound. Let's say for this case that the archer did hit with a 5. Now we would be able to take any armor saves for the defender. In this case, we're going to use a different model, a different figurine here, and we'll say that he has light armor plus a shield. So he will be saving on a 5 and a 6. And there is a 5, so that is a successful save of that wound, no damage done. And just as with shooting, there are also armor save modifiers depending upon the strength of the attack. We can use the same chart to show you this. If we take the strength of the attacker plus any modifiers for the weapon, we see that on a 1 to 3 there are no modifiers, but on a 4 a -1, 5 -2, 6 -3, 7 -4, 8 -5, and 9 plus -6. So for example, had we been using a weapon here that gave 1 plus to the strength of the archer in his attack, his strength would now be a 4, which would mean a -1 modifier to the armor and the shield save of this orc. Thus, instead of saving on a 5 or 6, he would now only be able to save on a 6. And in this case, he would have failed and suffered the wound. The parry. Bucklers are small shields which offer no increase to the armor saving throw, but allow you to parry attacks. Swords are also used to parry enemy attacks. The way this works is that when an opponent scores a hit, warriors equipped with bucklers or swords may try to parry the blow. What you will need to do is to roll a d6. If the score is higher than the number your opponent rolled to hit, the buckler or sword has parried the strike. Note that it is therefore impossible to parry a blow which scored a 6 on the roll to hit. So for example, if the roll to hit were a 4 and we had a buckler or a sword and we rolled a parry of a 5, then we would have successfully parried that attack and it would not have gone through. And it is important to note that a buckler or sword may only parry 1 blow per hand-to-hand combat phase. If your opponent scored several hits, you will have to try to beat the highest score. And if the highest score is a 6, you automatically lose the chance of parrying that opponent's attacks. Likewise, if you are fighting against several opponents, you may only parry the strike from the enemy who makes the first hit or hits. Warriors knocked down. If an enemy is fighting a warrior who is knocked down, he may attack him to put him out of his misery. All attacks against a warrior who is knocked down hit automatically. If any of the attacks wound the knockdown model and he fails his armor save, he is automatically taken out of action, as explained previously. A knockdown model may not parry. So in this example, we have the orc who is knocked down on his back face up, and we have the archer here attacking. If he's attacking, he automatically hits. He will then be wounding on a 5, and that is a wound, which means he is automatically removed from the game. In contrast, a stunned warrior is at the mercy of his enemies. A stunned model is automatically taken out of action if an enemy can attack him in hand-to-hand combat. So were this the combat here and the archer were attacking this orc, the archer would simply be able to take him out of combat by attacking him. It is important to note that if an attacking model has more than 1 hit, it is not possible then to knock down or stun that model and remove him in the same turn. It is nevertheless possible that you are able to remove a model if you are working together with more than 1 attacking model in that combat phase. So in this example, we may have the archer here who is able to attack this orc and to stun him. And then when it is this turn for this archer to attack, he can then take him out of action. In this sense, by working together, you are able to remove models in 1 turn. It is important to remember that if you are in combat like this archer and you have a model who is knocked down or stunned and another one who is standing, this archer cannot attack that one, but instead must direct his attack against the standing opponent. Remember, you will always attack the model that has a greater threat. Once models are engaged in hand-to-hand combat, they cannot move away during their movement phase. They must fight until they are either taken out of action, until they take out their enemies, or until one or the other breaks and runs. The exception to this rule, however, is if in this combat, for example, the archer is fighting the two orcs and both of them are either stunned or knocked down, then the archer would be free to move out of that combat. In addition, not only can he move out of the combat, but during his movement phase he may declare a charge against a new enemy and charge out of that combat into a brand new combat. Breaking from combat. A warrior who panics while fighting in hand-to-hand combat will break off and make a run for it, as described in the Leadership and Psychology section, which we will cover in a little bit. When a fighter breaks from combat, he simply turns around where he is and he runs off 2d6, and each of the remaining warriors now are able to inflict one hit, which is worked out immediately. Note that warriors cannot choose to leave a fight voluntarily, but they can only do so when they break.